The industrial park lot baked in sunlight. Luxury cars gleamed, contrasting sharply with a scarred, dented 1969 Ford Mustang tucked in the corner. CEO Victoria Albright, impeccably dressed and radiating cold disdain, stepped out of her Maybach, pointed at the old car and laughed. "That car is junk." Nearby, Ethan, the janitor, paused his sweeping. Just 100 yards away, the $2 billion prototype engine, the Apex, sat dormant, flashing a fatal, unfixable error. Ethan set down his broom. His gaze moved from the CEO to the silent machine. "Can I try?" The laughter died instantly. The world froze. Ethan was officially a facility maintenance technician, the janitor in Titan Dynamics Research and Development Wing. His routine was predictable: sweeping carbon dust, ferrying tools, and mopping spills. He was a silent presence, a ghost in the machine, moving through the labs unnoticed. His knowledge was invisible beneath his faded uniform. He never lingered or offered opinions. This was a chosen exile, a fortress of anonymity he had built to protect the quiet life he needed. He was a single father to an 8-year-old girl named Clara. His life revolved around the strict schedule required to drop her off at school before dawn and pick her up precisely at 5. The janitorial job granted him that rigid, necessary consistency. The 1969 Mustang, the junk car, was his entire world outside of Clara. He had restored its engine himself by ear, long ago. It was a mechanical metaphor for himself: old, scarred, reliable, and fundamentally honest. Its engine ran true without layers of computer-managed pretense. What none of the engineers knew was Ethan Hayes' past. 5 years ago, he was a leading high-output engine calibration engineer, renowned for his rare, almost synesthetic talent. The power to listen to an engine, feel the micro vibrations, and hear an unbalanced combustion cycle better than any sensor array. He was a master of the physical reality of thermodynamics. His gift was less about calculation and more about instantaneous, intuitive understanding. For him, the engine didn't just run, it sang a complex, multi-layered song, and any dissonance was a clear, unignorable scream. This profound connection made his resignation even more painful. Choosing silence meant deafening himself to his life's passion. His career ended abruptly with a conscious, devastating resignation. He refused to sign off on a crucial certification report after data for the previous high-output engine line. The Apex's ancestor was dangerously manipulated by corporate mandate to dismiss a resonant fault that only appeared under prolonged high-stress operation, potentially risking lives. He walked away from the 6-figure salary, choosing silence and peace. He chose a job where the only thing he had to clean up was physical mess, not the moral contamination of corrupted data. Ms. Victoria Albright represented everything he had fled. She was the ruthless face of Titan Dynamics, obsessed with surface perfection and known for public displays of contempt toward anyone she considered non-essential. She used the janitor's beat-up Mustang as a deliberate tool to reinforce the corporate hierarchy. "A beautiful reminder, gentlemen," she'd once remarked to her management team, "of what happens when you settle for anything less than perfection." Sonnerly, the perfection she referred to was the Apex, the $2 billion engine project, promising unlimited clean energy. In his daily rounds, even through the protective glass of the observation deck, Ethan would linger near the massive test bed. While the engineers focused intently on the digital readouts, the RPMs, the torque curves, the thermal dispersion, Ethan simply listened to the frequency signature. The engineers respected the data as presented by the system. Ethan respected the reality of the metal. Over the last month, he had noticed a subtle anomaly in the test-based sonic signature, a high-frequency chatter during the low idle test that was not supposed to be there. The sound was faint, barely registerable, a ghost vibration, but to Ethan's trained ear, it was the voice of a dying engine. The diagnostic software, running millions of lines of proprietary code, consistently reported parameters within limits. But the sound told a different story. The metal was lying because the software was lying for it. And now the Apex was refusing to start at all, The electronic lock, a final admission of failure. The entire team was paralyzed, staring blankly at the red error code. Their reliance on the software was absolute. Their crisis was a crisis of data, but Ethan knew with chilling certainty that it was a crisis of truth. He set down his worn broom. He had lived in the shadows for 5 years, but some truths were simply too loud to ignore. The situation escalated rapidly from a technical glitch to an existential corporate threat. The Apex engine, slated for a crucial demonstration for high-level European partners, remained stubbornly inert. The test countdown had been paused for an unbearable 45 minutes. The engineering team, led by Dr. Julian Vance, whose job depended on the next 5 minutes, was frantic. They cycled through every standardized procedure, checking fuel lines, spark timing, and running full diagnostic sweeps, even rebooting the main sequencing computer. Each attempt was met with the same result. The control software confirmed. No component failure, no critical error. Yet the engine refused to achieve stable ignition. When they did manage a brief start, the noise was horrific. A violent, shuddering roar followed by an immediate, forced shutdown due to abnormal internal resonance. Cylinder 3 is overheating. It's dumping energy too fast, but the system says we're fine. Doctor, Vance countered, frantically scrolling. He was caught in the loop of absolute faith in the data and absolute rejection of the reality before him. Dr. Vance's professional facade was fraying, his face slick with sweat. He knew what this delay meant. Ms. Albright had personally guaranteed a flawless demonstration. The $2 billion project and their careers were balanced precariously. Ms. Albright, observing from the inner office, was cold fury personified. She slammed her hand down on the mahogany table, not caring that the sound was audible through the intercom. This isn't a university project, Vance. This is a 5-year, multi-billion-dollar statement. Get that noise under control before the partners get here, or you'll be sweeping floors with haze. She was on the phone, her voice a low, dangerous growl. I don't care about your limits, Vance. Fix it now. The partners are walking in 5 minutes. This engine will start, and it will be smooth. Her insistence wasn't about the engine's functionality, but the optics of its performance. Her threat solidified the engineers' fear, forcing them to double down on the corrupted, clean data. Ethan, having just finished cleaning the adjacent coolant pump station, watched. He didn't look at the screens. He listened to the silence of the massive engine and the tight, tense silence of the room. He felt the atmosphere shift, the panic, the desperation, the overwhelming pressure to perform and conform. He approached the thick, reinforced glass of the control room. Dr. Vance, wiping his brow, finally saw the faded uniform. What is it, Ethan? We need a clean rag, not advice. This is a 5 Sigma problem, not a mop job. Ethan ignored the condescension. The low-end resonance, he spoke, his voice quiet but carrying an unusual resonant weight. It's not an ignition fault. It's in the pre-combustion cycle. The fuel-air mix is rich on cylinder 5 and lean on 8. The system is compensating, yes, but the sensors are too damped to show the micro-correction cycles in real time. It's creating a harmonic feedback loop at 1,500 RPMs. Dr. Vance scoffed. Are you suggesting our proprietary, NASA-grade, multi-million-dollar sensors running the latest Titan OS are being fooled by a janitor? The software reports within limits across the board. It's a clean read. You hear what the computer wants you to hear, Ethan. Get back to your mop. The computer only reads the filtered output, Ethan countered, stepping closer to the glass. The raw signal is showing an asynchronous pressure wave. It's a mechanical flaw hidden by a data layer. Miss Albright, having just hung up her phone call, emerged from the inner office like a predator. Her eyes narrowed on Ethan. The visiting partners were now visible through the lobby windows. She needed a distraction, a spectacle. Mr. Hayes, Albright said, her voice dripping with cruel sarcasm. You think you know better than 30 million lines of cutting-edge code? Than the finest engineers in the world? By all means. She gestured grandly toward the control deck as the partners filed in. Let him entertain us. Her words were meant to humiliate Ethan and momentarily ease the pressure on her team, turning the crisis into a spectacle of working-class folly. She wanted his failure to be public and absolute. Ethan felt the weight of every eye, every misplaced judgment, but he did not flinch. He had already accepted the price of stepping out of the shadows. He had to honor the medal. "I need manual access to the spark timing subcontroller," Ethan stated calmly, his voice regaining its professional steel as he addressed Dr. Vance, "and permission to disable the primary data filter, the raw signal only. I need to see the real pressure curve, not the marketing version." Dr. Vance, under the direct, paralyzing gaze of his CEO and now the arriving, stone-faced partners, hesitated, but Albright simply waved a hand. "Give him what he wants, quickly. The show begins." The pressure was entirely concentrated on a man without a title. Ethan walked toward the testbed door, his old uniform an incongruous sight among the expensive instruments. The absurd, crucial decision, a janitor being allowed to touch a $2 billion engine, had just been approved. Ethan climbed onto the gantry overlooking the apex. He moved with a practiced economy that betrayed his janitor persona. He ignored the partners, the CEO, and the dumbfounded engineering team watching through the thick glass. His focus narrowed to the massive, silent machine. He pulled a small, outdated diagnostic reader, a generic black box, a tool he had kept for 5 years, from his pocket. It looked pitiful next to Titan's proprietary arrays. As Ethan connected his reader to an auxiliary port, bypassing 3 levels of security with practiced keystrokes, Dr. Vance leaned into the microphone. "Gentlemen, Mr. Hayes is performing a low-level diagnostic sweep using his personal device," his patronizing humor rapidly dissolving. "We expect to resume testing shortly." Ethan typed a brief custom command into the console, overriding the system's protective shell. A moment later, he looked up, his gaze piercing the glass and settling on Dr. Vance. "The fuel injector timing is half a degree off on intake. It's micro-slippage. Your predictive software is masking it as standard thermal drift. It's an original G-line resonance defect, amplified by the fusion cycle." The partners, especially the head of the European delegation, exchanged sharp, deeply concerned glances. One of the senior engineers, Mark, frantically pulled up an old employee database on a discrete monitor. He finally recognized the way Ethan moved, the confidence in his hands, the specific, almost surgical way he held the cable. He whispered, horrified, to Dr. Vance, "Wait, that stance. That's the classic Hayes grip. The profile matches the 2020 regulatory file. Boss, is that Ethan Hayes? The calibration guy who walked?" The name Hayes ricocheted around the control room. Ethan Hayes. The legend. The ghost. The man who walked away from the biggest contract in history. He was the foundational architect of the original technology they were desperately trying to modify. And the true architect of the engine, the Apex, was fundamentally built upon. His presence wasn't an insult. It was a devastating, silent indictment of the entire room. "Disable the G4 data filter now," Ethan commanded, his voice suddenly loud, cutting through the tension with the authority of absolute knowledge. Dr. Vance, stunned into obedience, stammered. But that's the within limits smoothing layer. It's proprietary. It'll show the raw volatility. We can't show the partners the raw data." "You must," Ethan retorted, his eyes blazing with moral certainty. "I want to see the lie you built your $2 billion presentation on." Vance, paralyzed by the CEO's silence and Ethan's power, nervously punched the override sequence. The massive control room screen, previously displaying smooth, reassuring graphs of performance, instantly transformed into a jagged, chaotic nightmare. The waveforms for cylinders 5 and 8 were violently asymmetrical, confirming Ethan's exact half-degree diagnosis down to the millisecond. A collective gasp escaped the engineering team. The chaotic, spiking lines, the authentic, lethal truth, painted a picture of imminent mechanical failure. The team leaders, Mark and Dr. Vance, looked utterly betrayed, realizing not only that the data was false, but that they had been willfully blind to the engine's suffering for weeks. "It's worse than we thought," whispered Mark, staring at the raw thermal spikes. It would have torn itself apart within minutes under a full load. The system hadn't failed. It had been taught to lie, filtering out the truth to present a clean face. The partners stared at the graphs, recognizing the signature of a severe, potentially deadly instability issue. Ethan swiftly moved to the engine block. He didn't use software or the complex console. He used two small mechanical wrenches, an 8mm and a 5/16. With a precise, near-invisible movement, he adjusted two tiny physical actuators on the injection manifold, the very mechanism he had designed a decade ago. He was correcting a minuscule systemic fault, a flaw that had been hidden by the CEO's desperate rush to market. He straightened up, wiped his greasy hands on his uniform with a clean rag he'd brought, and gave a single firm nod. "Try the ignition cycle now. Full sequence." The air was heavy, thick with the scent of high-octane fuel, fear, and ozone. Dr. Vance, pale and shaking, hit the final sequence button. The Apex prototype engine, the $2 billion Titan, didn't shudder or fail. It came to life with a deep, resonant, and utterly stable growl. The complex machinery hummed with perfect, balanced power. The chaotic, jagged graphics on the screen smoothed instantly into textbook-perfect, controlled curves. The micro-vibrations were gone. The engine ran honest. The test bay was engulfed in a deafening silence that wasn't mechanical, but human. Ms. Albright's face was stone, stripped clean of makeup and facade. She realized the gravity of the situation was no longer about a failed demonstration or a janitor's heroism. It was about the exposure of a corporate crime she had authorized. Before anyone, especially Albright, could speak, Ethan walked back to the control console. He pulled up the master system log, the raw data stream before the G4 filter was applied, and then the log detailing the filter's implementation. He pointed to a command entry, dated 3 weeks prior, which initiated the filter and set its threshold of forgiveness. "This filter," Ethan said, his voice calm, addressing the partners directly. "The one that hid the half-degree slip, the one that turned critical volatility into within limits." He scrolled to the user authorization log. The entry was clear, signed digitally, and irrefutable. It was approved by a single administrator account, the account belonging to Ms. Albright, the CEO. The head partner, Mr. Richter, stepped forward, his cold eyes narrowed. The partners didn't need an explanation. The within limits software layer, the G4 filter, was designed to systematically conceal a critical mechanical flaw, a flaw that would have been a deadly liability in the field. It was intentional sabotage of the data integrity, a corporate crime approved by the CEO herself, designed solely to bypass the pre-launch presentation and secure the massive contract. "This demonstration is concluded," Mr. Richter announced, his voice booming and final, cutting through Albright's rising, desperate protest. "We are requesting an immediate, full, independent technical audit of all historical data, the G4 filter implementation, and the Apex project's safety protocols. We require the logs and the full testimony of Mr. Hayes, effective immediately." The decision was absolute. Ms. Albright's multi-billion-dollar empire, built on a foundation of data manipulation and arrogant contempt, had just begun to crack, shattered by a janitor's integrity. Ethan Hayes, the man who sought nothing but quiet, had delivered the fatal blow with 2 turns of a wrench and a scroll of a mouse. The aftermath was immediate, brutal, and utterly silent. The European partners left, their faces grim, taking copies of the raw data logs in the formal system audit request. Ms. Albright was left standing in the silent control room, a disgraced queen surrounded by her once loyal, but now terrified court. The internal board of directors was convened in an emergency session via video conference within the hour. The meeting was hostile and swift. Ms. Albright, initially defiant, attempted to maintain her composure, arguing that the manual adjustments were unnecessary, that the flaw was merely a minor calibration issue, and that Ethan Hayes was a disgruntled former employee seeking revenge using obsolete knowledge. "He is a janitor now, gentlemen," she hissed into the camera. "His word means nothing compared to the millions we have invested in automated diagnostic veracity." But the technical evidence presented by a rapidly terrified Dr. Vance, who wisely chose self-preservation, was irrefutable. The logs, certified by the partner's own team, showed the G4 filter, approved under her key, had systematically scrubbed the volatile data points for weeks, creating a smooth, false narrative of the engine's performance. The old guard engineers, now terrified of being implicated in a potential safety fraud scandal, finally broke ranks. Mark, the engineer who recognized Ethan, was the first to speak up, his voice shaking. The pressure to hit the green was constant, Ms. Albright. We were told to trust the output over the signal. The G4 filter was known informally as the Albright Assurance Layer. It was designed to bypass any deviation that might threaten the launch schedule. Another engineer, visibly distraught, confirmed the story. We filed internal warnings about dampening the resonant frequency data, but they were signed off as acceptable performance smoothing by the CEO's office. Infernum. The walls were closing in. The $2 billion Apex project was immediately placed under full administrative suspension. The company's stock plummeted 15% in after-hours trading, sending shockwaves through the market. That afternoon, two men from the Technical Oversight and Safety Commission, the same government body Ethan had refused to compromise for 5 years prior, walked into the facility armed with a court order. They seized all electronic records, sealed the test bay, and began their investigation into systematic corporate fraud. The sight of the government seal on the Apex engine was the final, devastating symbol of Albright's fall. Before the day was out, the board's decision was delivered. Ms. Victoria Albright was suspended from all executive duties, pending the conclusion of the internal and external audits. Her access was revoked, and her company phone was cut off. Her empire, once seemingly impregnable, built on ambition and contempt, had been toppled not by a rival corporation, but by a single honest engine calibration performed by the lowest paid person in the building. Meanwhile, Ethan Hayes became the reluctant center of attention. Dr. Vance, shamefaced, approached him, offering profuse apologies, praise, and desperate assurances of a massive, immediate promotion, complete with a corner office and a 6-figure salary. The other engineers, realizing their mistake, offered congratulations laced with thinly veiled career anxiety. Ethan listened patiently, his hands folded across his chest, the janitor's uniform looking oddly authoritative in the chaos. He looked around the spotless, now quiet test bay, a space he had cleaned 1,000 times. He looked at the faces, searching not for respect, but for honesty. "I don't want a promotion," Ethan said, his voice carrying the calm weight of finality, silencing the anxious crowd. He paused, making sure his words sank into the sudden quiet. He looked specifically at the spot in the parking lot where Ms. Albright had scornfully pointed just hours before. "That Mustang runs honest," he stated simply, his final decree to the corporate world. "It tells you the truth about the engine, the frame, and the driver. That is all I ever required." He picked up his broom, which still rested where he had dropped it hours earlier. He performed one final, meticulous sweep of the test bay floor, a symbolic act of returning to the simplest, most honest work. The entire facility fell silent. The culture of top-down contempt, the arrogance that had dismissed the man in his honest car, had been exposed and irrevocably broken. The janitor was gone, but the truth of the Mustang remained. The investigation unfolded quickly, confirming every point Ethan Hayes had exposed. Ms. Albright's intentional data manipulation was proven to be a long-standing, systematic failure to prioritize safety and integrity. She was permanently removed from her position, facing civil and criminal penalties, in the complete collapse of her reputation. The Titan Dynamics Board, now facing intense public and regulatory scrutiny and desperate for public trust, issued a massive, unprecedented public apology. A new era dawned at the corporation. New transparent protocols were immediately instituted, prioritizing raw data integrity over performance metrics. The board realized that their pursuit of perfection had blinded them to the ethical foundation of engineering. The board then unanimously reached out to Ethan Hayes. They didn't just offer him his old job, they offered him the prestigious role of Chief Technical Integrity Officer, a newly created C-level position with a substantial 7-figure salary, full benefits, and a mandate to oversee all calibration and safety checks without any executive interference. It was an offer to reclaim his former glory, power, and prestige, offering him full control over the technical truth he had risked everything for. Ethan sat in the gleaming new corporate office, which he himself had just swept clean earlier that morning, finishing his final shift as a janitor. He listened respectfully to the elaborate presentation. "Thank you," he finally said, his gaze steady. "But I decline the title." The stunned board members pressed him. "Why, Mr. Hayes? You deserve the authority. You are the only man we trust with the truth." Ethan smiled faintly, a look of quiet peace settling over him. "I want to spend my afternoons with my daughter, not in board meetings. My power is in the truth, not the title. If I take the title, I become part of the system that created the G4 filter. I choose to remain outside it." His integrity was non-negotiable, even for the highest price. He made only one request. He asked that a new single-line technical mandate be issued across the entire company, to be posted not only in every test bay and engineering cubicle, but in the lobby, in the executive washrooms. The board, humbled and fully acquiescent, agreed. The new policy, a stark and simple statement printed on polished steel plaques, read, "Technical honesty is the only measurable metric." Ethan accepted a significantly reduced role as a part-time, highly paid senior technical consultant, reporting directly to the board's audit committee. His job was to conduct random, unfiltered audits, ensuring the truth was never muffled by ambition again. He was given a mandate to be the perpetual internal skeptic, the honest calibration that the company had desperately needed. Later that afternoon, Ethan Hayes walked out of the massive R&D building for the last time as an employee, and the first time as the company's moral compass. He walked back to the corner of the parking lot. He opened the door of the 1969 Mustang. He inserted the key, turned the ignition, and the old V8 engine caught with a single, perfectly timed, deep burble. The sound was steady, true, and utterly reliable. A janitor's car, once mocked as junk, was now the loudest, most honest thing in the entire corporate parking lot. It was the vehicle that had been driven by integrity, and it was the integrity that had finally toppled an empire built on lies. He drove home to pick up Clara. If you believe stories like this deserve to be told, leave a comment and subscribe to TT Healing Tales. We tell the stories that shouldn't be forgotten.